Great. So hi, everybody. My name is Emily Dundas Oak. I'm very pleased to be working with Massy Arts and Massy Books. Massy Books is a Indigenous-owned bookstore located on the unceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. As such, being unceded, but being a treaty person myself, I recognize that these lands, these waters, remain under the direction of our host nations, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. Without a formal treaty agreement, I consider this an invitation to every day think through what agreement I'm making with these host nations. As an Indigenous-owned bookstore, we hope that in attending our events and hearing from the brilliant authors who share with us, that you'll consider learning more about these waters and lands and the host nations who guide them. Today, your speakers are all streaming in from coastal areas not far from me, but also from the interior in Secwepemc territory. I think we're all here on the coast. Maybe I won't speak for everybody, but I'm much welcoming this colder weather and this rain that we're having, especially after such a summer of stress for our communities and our lands and all the species who call these lands home. We know that the stress that folks have endured this summer is a direct result of climate change, and that really in order to counter this kind of devastating violence that is ongoing, that we must look to our host nations for how to best be respectful in establishing a future together. So I encourage you, wherever you're tuning in, to maybe spend some time familiarizing yourself with the calls to action that host nations are putting out in your territory. Here we follow, we try to stay up to date on initiatives, and one that I'd like to share with you is the Tsleil-Waututh Mountain Sacred Trust. So recognizing that the pipelines going through lands and waters is, contributing to the violence that we're seeing against, various species on this land, the Tsleil-Waututh Nation has asked to stop the Trans Mountain Pipeline and are, seeking funds and showing their direction in the Tsleil-Waututh Sacred Trust initiative. So in the chat, I will share the link to that initiative, encourage you to learn more about it, and should you have the means, encourage you to donate as well and share the cause. Without further ado, we're here to celebrate some brilliant authors, both the authors whose books we're celebrating today. So Rachel Rose, author of The Octopus Has Three Hearts, and Maria Reva, Good Citizens Need Not Fear. But we're also so pleased that we have a brilliant author and poet moderating this event. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to be introducing Renée Sarojini Saklikar. And I'll just put the link to the Massy Books online store, the whole link to our whole store in the chat, because really each of these authors, if I were to link every individual book that these authors have contributed, it would overwhelm you. But all their books are available through Massy Books. We're very pleased if you want to come visit us in Vancouver's Chinatown, adjacent to Hogan's Alley, and come say hello and pick the books up. But no matter where you're joining us from today, we can get books to you through online orders, phone, email. We want to get these brilliant stories and words into your hands, so please reach out in any way. I'll put the link to our store as well as our contact information. I'm sure you'll have many questions for our authors, and we're very pleased to be doing an audience Q&A. So throughout the event, if you have any questions that you would like to ask our authors, please message them directly to me, Emily Massy Arts, in the chat, and we'll be happy to voice those aloud near the end of the event. Thank you so much. I'll pass it on to you, Renée, and thank you to our brilliant authors and everybody for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Emily. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, it's all good? All right. I am so honored to celebrate two extraordinary authors and their brilliant stories. Welcome, everyone, to Strange Beasts and Good Citizens. We're going to begin with readings from first Rachel Rose, and then Maria Reva. So we'll do the readings. And then once both authors have read, I'm going to ask a few questions and then get into conversation. And as Emily so beautifully said, we'll also be taking your questions and we look forward to them. Let's begin with Rachel Rose. I'm going to read her bio, say a few short words about her brilliant new collection. And then Rachel, I'm going to ask you to read. Rachel Rose is the author of 4 collections of poetry and a memoir, The Dog Lover Unit, Lessons in Courage from the World's Canine Cops. It was shortlisted for the Arthur Ellis Award for Best Nonfiction Crime Book in 2018. She is also the recipient of numerous awards for her poetry, including the Pat Lowther Memorial Award and 2 Pushcart Prizes, as well as a nomination for a Governor General's Literary Award. She is the Poet Laureate Emerita of Vancouver, BC, where she now lives, and the opera for which she wrote the libretto When the Sun Comes Out with composer Leslie Ueda will be at Portland Opera in 2023. Now, her stories. The Octopus Has Three Hearts is a collection about damaged people who have committed, witnessed, or survived terrible acts, and who must make their way in indeed an unforgiving world. And we're delighted to say it's just been longlisted for the 2021 Scotia Bank Giller Prize. Congratulations, Rachel. I'm now going to invite you to read from The Octopus Has Three Hearts.
Thank you so much, Renee. Thank you. I just want to take a minute to welcome everyone. So hello to all you good citizens, wherever you are. Hello, Seattle. Hello, Toronto. Hello, Sunshine Coast. It's just a delight to be here. You know, I'm alone in my basement and yet together with all of you. And I wish we could be in person, but this is still just terrific. And it's an honor to read with Maria and to meet her for the first time and to read with Renee. Both of you, I admire your work so much. I wanted to just say that I love Massy Books. I was there a couple of days ago. Massy delivered to my door during the pandemic when it wasn't safe to go in, and they kept me well supplied with books. And they're just such a hub of our community and a dangerous place for me to go because I always go out with a stack of incredible new to me books. So I'm a proud supporter. And I also just wanted to say, like so many of you, walking became my only sort of outlet during the pandemic. And I walked and walked my neighborhood. And every walk, I was grateful to be living here on these unceded Coast Salish territories where we can be outside almost year round, where we have the ocean and the mountains. And it's just such a privilege to live here. So thank you. I'm going to read just a little bit of 2 beginnings. I'll read a bit of Porcodile for Renee, and I'm going to read a little bit of Rats and Men. That's the first story in my book. Cigarette, demanded the punk, getting right in my face as I walked past him with my mango smoothie. He was an angry white man with a face tattoo and a black rat on his shoulder. Sorry, I don't smoke. Spare change? Sorry, no change, I said, patting my pockets, which was the truth. But sorry was obviously not what he wanted to hear, because as I walked by, the punk punched me in the stomach. The rat gripped him with its claws, swinging its tail for ballast and hanging on tight. I dropped my smoothie, mango slush all over the sidewalk, and doubled over. When I could stand up again, he was nearly out of sight, weaving around cars at something between a jog and a run. I held my stomach, trying to catch my breath, and then I carefully stood up and began to walk down the street. I found it hard to walk. I was dizzy. That punch hurt so bad. I leaned against the wall next to the Starbucks. A mom was sitting at a table, nursing her toddler. Excuse me, are you okay? She asked me. He hit you pretty hard. I took my hand away so I could brace myself against the wall. Oh my God, said the mom. I looked down. Blood leaked through my t-shirt. The toddler pulled off the boob with a loud pop and stared. Owie. he said, pointing at me. Her nipple shed a fine spray of milk until she tucked it back in her blouse. I wobbled. Sit down. I think you got stabbed. I think he stabbed you, said the mom, reaching for her phone. Can I get some help here? That's all I remember. It was like staring into the sun. Everything went red after that. I often thought about that punk and his rat in the long days and nights of my recovery. His knife pierced my large intestine and I went septic. I had to have a length of bowel removed, and for 6 months after, I walked around tethered to a bag of my own shit. I lost over 100 pounds. The police interviewed me, of course. They told me it might be too late to catch the punk, but that turned out not to be true because he did the same thing to someone else, a dude this time. I thought we should meet up for support or commiseration, but the doctor said they couldn't release the other victim's name. I figured he was at the same hospital on the same floor that I was. That was kind of interesting. Maybe he's the one, I told the night nurse. Maybe we'll meet and fall in love and have a wedding with his and hers colostomy bags. And I'll stop there and I'll move on to Porcodillo. Porcodillo. I hated his friends, his clothes, his hair, and his attitude. Most of all, I hated his music. He played guitar and was lead singer in a thrashcore band, Core Brutality. His music infiltrated my house, took over my garage, fucked up my ears. Summer afternoons were the worst. When he was little and we stuck him in soccer camp, I'd been accustomed to kicking back in the freshly mowed yard, cracking open a beer, watching butterflies riot on the butterfly bush in companionable silence with my wife. Now, afternoons were spent wearing ear protection, trying to lip read whatever chores my wife wanted me to do while the house seethed with ear-splitting caterwaul from the attached garage where Jackson, my only son, tortured his guitar. Francis Bacon, our endearing but hideous pot-bellied pig, heard noises that we couldn't even register and found Jackson's jam sessions even more painful than we did. He retreated to the mudroom at the back of the house where he lay sighing among the work boots and scrub brushes. Even the pig's curly tail drooped. Francis, darling, I couldn't agree more, I overheard Kate say. Macaroon? A brief snuffling followed and Kate came into the living room, Francis trotting at her heels. They landed on the couch, one on either side of me. I put an arm around each of them. Wife, dad, pig, son in the garage, contaminating our ears with his noise pollution. We waited too late to have kids and could only have the one. Only one, but he's a good one, Kate liked to say. And then she stopped saying it. Jackson wasn't a good one. He was, as they say now, troubled. Not like I was troubled at his age, drinking too much, getting into fights, telling lies to get with girls, singing rock and roll. No, Jackson was troubled in a way that sometimes made the hair stand up on my arms. I systematically hid all the knives in our house. Later, I made sure we had first aid kits on every floor with naloxone in them. And I'll just stop right there. Thank you so much.
Devastating. Oh, thank you, Rachel. Your stories resonate on so many levels. We'll get into, I hope, some conversation. First now, I'm going to introduce Maria Reva and then ask her to read a little from her collection, and then we'll get into the questions. Maria Reva writes fiction and opera libretti. Here's a few places her writing has appeared: The Atlantic, McSweeney's, The Wall Street Journal, Granta, and the Best American Short Stories. She won a National Magazine Award in 2019 and was a finalist for the Writers' Trust of Canada 2020 Fiction Prize. She was born in Ukraine and grew up in New Westminster, British Columbia. She received her MFA from the Michener Center for Writers at the University of Texas. Good Citizens Need Not Fear is a brilliant and bitingly funny collection of stories united around a single, crumbling apartment building in Ukraine. Maria, welcome. And as I did with Rachel, I'm going to ask you to open it up, reading a little from one of your stories, if you would.
Hi, Renee. Thank you for that, and thank you everybody for being here, and thank you to Massy Books for having us. So the story I'm going to be reading from is called Letter of Apology. Just to introduce it a little bit, it's written from the perspective of a Secret Service agent who is tasked with retrieving a letter of apology from a poet who has uttered a subversive political joke in public. And because these are the waning years of the Soviet Union, the Secret Service no longer outright arrested people. They had to kind of re-educate them. So in this scene, this is the first time that this agent has approached the poet, and he has come to his dacha, so kind of like a summer house, which happens to be flooded. So that's why everyone in this scene is either sitting on a rowboat or on top of a wooden table. Okay. I had conducted dozens of these conversations before, and always began from a friendly place, as if we were two regular people, pals even, just chatting. Quite the flood, I remarked. Yes, confirmed Konstantin Ilyich, the flood. I'll bet the children love it here. No children, the poet said. Usually there were children. I stretched my legs out in the rowboat, which upset its balance, and jerked them back. No parents, grandparents, aunts, or uncles either, said Milena Markovna, that's his wife. Her upper lip curled, the beginning of a sneer, as if to say, but you already knew that, didn't you? There had indeed been mention in the file of a mass reprimand of Milena Markovna's relatives in the 50s, but amid all the other facts about all the other residents of this town, with all their sordid family histories, the detail had slipped my mind. Still, did the woman have to dampen the spirit of the conversation? Konstantin Ilyich broke the silence. So what's the joke? I hadn't made a joke, I said. No, the joke I supposedly told about the party. Already he was incriminating himself. The term I used was wrongful evaluation, but thank you for specifying the offense, Konstantin Ilyich. You're welcome, he said unexpectedly. What was it? I cannot repeat the joke. I admit I had searched Konstantin Ilyic's file for it, but one of the typists had already redacted the words. You can't repeat the joke you're accusing me of telling. Correct. Then, before I could stop myself, perhaps you could repeat the joke and I'll confirm whether or not it's the one. Konstantin Ilyich narrowed his eyes, but said nothing. We aren't moving any closer to a solution. Tell me the problem first, he said. A brown leaf, curled in the shape of a robed figurine, floated by Milena Markovna's foot. She pressed the leaf into the murky water with her thumb before turning to her husband. Just say sorry and be done with it. I thanked her for her intuition. An apology was precisely what was in order in the form of a letter within 30 days. Milena Markovna advised me not to thank her, since she hadn't done anything to help me. In fact, she hated officers like me, and it was because of officers like me that she had grown up alone in this world. But at least she had nothing to lose, and could do anything she wanted to. She could spit in my face if she wanted to. This I did not recommend. Konstantin Ilyich was tapping his fingernails on the table. I'm not putting anything down in writing. It is usually at this point in the conversation, when the written word comes up, that the perpetrator becomes most uncomfortable, begins to wriggle. Few people grasp the simple logic of the situation. Once a transgression occurs and a case file opens, the case file triggers a response, in this case, a letter of apology. One document exposes the problem, the second resolves it. One cannot function without the other, just as a bolt cannot function without a nut, and a nut cannot function without a bolt. And so I told Konstantin Ilyich, I'm afraid you don't have a choice. And that was it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Maria, your stories, I'm pausing because your stories, like Rachel's, are so funny with this mordant wit and so sinister at the same time. I find them quite unsettling and utterly compelling. So I'm going to ask the audience to hold those readings in your mind, because weren't they fabulous? And I've got some questions now to ask. First Rachel, and then Maria. So Rachel, people are sometimes, I think, encouraged to read fiction because it's good for them, because it develops empathy. But thinking about the Octopus's Three Hearts, is empathy a purely good emotion? Can you talk to me about what I think you've sometimes termed the moral hazards of empathy in fiction?
Okay, yes, I have a lot to say about that, actually. So I'll take an example that's happening right now all around us. And, people think that empathy is a purely good emotion as long as other people are empathetic to their cause, their belief, their ideology, or their politics. But right now, in our province and across our country, we have anti-vaxxers. So my friend Simon said on the far right, the anti-vaxxers are sure that Jesus will protect them from COVID. And on the far left, they're sure that it's lavender oil and homeopathic treatments that will protect them. But they're both awash in empathy for themselves and for their unvaccinated cohort. And they don't have so much empathy maybe for the healthcare workers or for other people who are trying to protect them. And, they feel that they're so persecuted that they're putting on yellow stars because they're just like Holocaust survivors. And this is happening across our country. And so I think that's an example of toxic empathy. And I don't want my readers to feel empathy when they read my stories. I want to, make them laugh, and then I want to make them think. I want to make them think. And if there's an emotion that I want to engender, it might be compassion, because compassion, unlike empathy, does not force you to choose a side. You can have compassion for both sides or all sides, even if people do terrible things.
It's absolutely fascinating. I could do a session, and I hope we do, just on this. And each of your stories twists us around in this way. Thank you for that very, I think, gutsy response and thought. I maybe you'll write an op-ed piece about it. I think it's needed. I'm going to now go to Maria, but I'm hoping your comments will have twigged for the audience as well. And I'm going to come back to Rachel, and we're going to do a mini deep dive into that excerpt she read about Porcodillo. If you haven't purchased The Octopus Has Three Hearts, you really need to get on that. But now I'm going to turn it to Maria, if you want to unmute. And my question for you to begin, Maria, is the following. You're writing about ordinary people undergoing huge historical change, and your stories are powerfully evoking and describing situations where people are caught up in the midst of social, political, economic upheaval. I wondered if you could tell us a bit about that and your research process for this book. And of course, and I hope it's not irritating, but I have to admit it, as a reader, really interested if any of the characters in Good Citizens Need Not Fear are based on real life. So it's a kind of two-part, your research process for how you got to these stories, and are any of these characters based on real life?
Yes. So because I was writing about ordinary people, while I did go to history books that spoke of the grand events of the Soviet Union, they couldn't tell me everything, right? They spoke about the grand figures, the grand political figures who had a role in these events. So to find out about how ordinary people thrived and survived and thrived in these very turbulent times, I spoke to my family, and I also did a lot of internet searching. So with my family, I was born in Ukraine. I was a child when, right after the Soviet Union, like all the chaos that inflation, kind of this barter economy that ensued. So I do have memories of it. Even though I actually have very happy memories of that time because I lived in a family where there was a lot of love, so I was cushioned. But then when I started interviewing my family about that time period, later as an adult, I found out a lot more about it. And of course, how difficult those times were. I found out family history, and some of these stories are based on family history. For example, there's a story about two people who make fur coats for the black market in those times. So my parents did that, right? So my parents, engineer and a chemist, finding themselves sewing fur coats, right, to make a living. So just, very, very strange times for sure. And in addition to that research, I looked on Reddit, actually. There are these two threads on Reddit that have hundreds and hundreds of responses. And the topics are, what was it like to live through the Soviet collapse? And people are just there, the stories are just boiling out of them. They want to talk about it. And so going through all those comments and seeing if there were, patterns, anomalies, that was part of the research.
Thank you for the generous, fascinating, boiling stories. People just boiling to say things. There's a sense of that in a very mordant way in Rachel's Porco Dio. And there's a fascinating question I think that Emily will bring up from our audience, but I'm going to get in there with my mini deep dive. Rachel, Porco Dio is full of a mordant wit that somehow, through different voices, embodies what I call a kind of caustic compassion. And I was really excited when I asked you the question about empathy, and you're turning that upside down and saying, well, let's think about compassion rather than empathy, especially in these times. I'm fascinated about the characters and the voice and the scenes in Porco Dio. And what backstory can you reveal to us about those themes and characters? How did you get into this white male voice in Porco Dio, and what is the backstory?
Oh my goodness, that's an interesting and mysterious kind of question for me. I'm going on CBC Books tomorrow on the radio for a show called How I Wrote It, and I am not sure. It's a mysterious process. These characters come to me sort of situationally. I'll think to myself, okay, what would happen if someone found themselves in this situation or having done this terrible thing? Where do you go from there? How do you continue to live the rest of your life? And then, they just bother me until I write them. They sort of stay with me and bother me until I write them. And I don't really understand that process, and I don't even care. I respect the mystery, and I want it to keep happening to me, but I guess the bigger picture is I'm drawn to conflict, and I'm drawn to the side that we don't want to see. And so in a sense, a lot of my stories are arguments. So if someone does this reprehensible thing, should we force them to live the rest of their life under a bridge? Do we revoke their human citizenship? And how do they make their way then through the rest of their years? And then if they have to do that, of course, most of my characters have found some kind of solace with animal companions as they're outcast from the human world. And so I ask also, who are the real beasts? And I've populated my book with bats and lizards and pigs and octopuses and creatures that tend to inspire loathing, although not for me, because I really wanted to break down those binaries between pet and food, and between those who we have empathy for and those who we despise. That's compelling to me, deeply compelling. I think all of my writing is about that. Indeed. Oh, and I'll just say we did have a pig named Francis Bacon when I was growing up on Hornby Island, and he was a huge, mean pig, and I was justifiably afraid of him. He was nothing like Francis Bacon in my story. So I'll leave it at that.
Oh, so much. And we're getting some very rich questions, which I'm going to ask Emily perhaps to share, although I can as well. Emily, did you have a favorite, or do you want me to go straight to the questions from the audience?
Hard to say favorites. They are really brilliant. If you want to hop in just with whatever ones are grabbing your attention, Renee, that'd be lovely.
All right. Well, Rachel, here's one. It goes, how does writing in first or third person affect the way you're thinking about these characters for whom you're not necessarily wanting us to have empathy with? I think this dovetails very nicely into your very thoughtful, interesting response to my Porco Dio question. So David is writing, how does writing in the first or third person affect the way you're thinking about these characters? And how are these two point of views different from you and what happens? Any thoughts?
Well, that's such a good question. Well, I think either way, I have to find an overlap. I have to find a way, you know, my characters, most of them are limited, but we all are limited by our own experiences and our own points of view, but I have to find a way in to them, whether they speak in the first or the third person. I have to find a way to connect. And I'm not even sure why some of them have become that first person voice. And it's some of the hardest ones for me to have found my way in, because they're maybe, well, they're all fairly repellent, but these are some of the more repellent ones. And I suppose it was a challenge that I wanted to take, to see how I could connect with them.
Indeed. Your responses are so thoughtful as always, but generous. I'm going to pivot to a question from Sashi Bhatt. Thank you so much for joining us. For Maria, thank you, Emily, for forwarding it to me. So Maria, what appeals to you about the novel in stories form? It was actually going to be one of my questions. And my deep dive with you are going to be 3 interconnected stories. So I think this is a good lead into that. What appeals to you about the novel in stories form?
This is the form that rose, I would say, organically as I was working on these stories. I didn't know that I was going to be working on a collection of stories or a novel in stories. I just started with the one, which was the Novostroika story. It's the opening one. And it introduces this building that, that all these citizens are living in. And once I was in that building, I wondered, well, what are the other tenants doing during these turbulent times? How are they surviving? So I started writing other stories, and it was kind of like walking through the building they were living in and turning on the lights in the different rooms and seeing these kind of family tableaus. So that's how it became a story collection. And why they were linked is because, as much as these tenants try to stay away from each other and as suspicious as they are of one another, they're living in such close quarters, right? And the walls are really thin and they could hear each other through the vents, And so that's how those connections came about. So yeah, and I think if this were structured as purely a novel rather than novel and stories or linked collection, I think I would have had to focus on 1 or 2 of the families, but that's not really what this building is. It's a collection of, multiple families living side by side, and they're equally, I think, important in this book. Yeah, thanks. That was a great question. Thank you.
It was, and I'm going to now dovetail into what I hope is a follow-up for Maria and maybe even for Rachel. I've got other questions, of course, but Maria, picking up on what you've just said, what Sassy was asking about, I want to zero in on these Zaya stories. Zaya apparently is a name that means little rabbit, if I'm not mistaken. And you have 3 stories of this female character, Little Rabbit, Miss USSR, and Homecoming. How did these Zaya stories come to you? And in it, you juxtapose, as Rachel does in her stories time and again, both of you, cruelty with pathos, compassion, and a very particular lexicon, diction, or language for your characters. Can you talk a little bit about all of that just briefly for these 3 stories? And then I'm going to ask Rachel the same.
Right. So with Zaya's stories, she she kind of flits in and out of the collection. She disappears and then she reappears kind of in a new iteration. She's kind of this chameleon character who takes on many different roles throughout the book. But she came about, she was inspired by this human rights report I was reading about the state of the orphanage system after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it was already an underfunded system, and you can imagine the kind of state it was in after everything went down. So there was this one little girl that this report mentioned, and it was about how she was bright, energetic, but she was born with a cleft palate and there was no one to advocate for a corrective surgery for her. So she couldn't learn how to speak. And because of that, she was kind of recategorized or deemed disabled by this institution. And she was sent to a different institution, which was notorious for being even worse for these children. They were just kind of forgotten and left to wilt. So, you know, reading about this little girl in this report, and then suddenly she just disappears from it. And that was really, really heartbreaking. And so I wrote this character kind of as my response, my imagined response of what could have happened to her. And I wanted to believe that she made it in this life, and that she was ultimately, she found a way to exist. That's what I wanted to prove, to myself at least. And in terms of the, Renée, you were asking about the cruelty question. Would you mind just repeating that part of it again?
Yes, I would love to. And I would love then to bring Rachel in, because I don't know how both of you feel, but when I'm reading your stories in these collections, I am struck by this feeling I have as a reader, constantly juxtaposed between, I feel there's a cruelty. I mean, the descriptions of what happens to Zaya with her hair lip stitched by a baba in a hut, or when Constantine, who then reappears in her life, gets her to impersonate a Ukrainian beauty contestant. It's macabre and funny and imaginative and dissettling. And it's like reading the father figure in Porco Dio with this deeply troubled son who, you know, comes to a very bad end, and the pig and the father and the unnamed mother in Porco Dio and the way they interact. I was sort of unsettled by getting into the character's point of view, and both of you use language and juxtaposition to do so. So maybe Maria, you can respond, and then I want to dovetail to Rachel and see how she responds. Maria?
I think this kind of macabre humor is just what I grew up with, and it's the kind of humor we have in my family. And I think it's pretty typical of folks who grew up in those times. I think when everything is out of your control and chaotic, I think you have to find some way of trying to rise above it and taking back your power. And I think people did that with humor. Right, because if you can joke about something, it's like you're taking the power away from that thing, and I think it's therapeutic as well. Like after the Chernobyl disaster, I mean, there were jokes flying about that like days after the public found out about it. So that's what it is. That's kind of the world we built for ourselves, and I'm seeing it in the pandemic as well. There's a kind of dark humor that's rising in North America that I haven't really seen before. It's quite interesting to witness. Yeah.
Thank you. Rachel, thoughts?
I loved your answer, Maria. I think that was also some of my experience, and having been close to violence or heard incidents that have crossed my path, as happens for many people as we go through life, and really just the inexplicable aspects of human nature. How can you know somebody well, you think, who's a good or normal person, and then does this terrible, incomprehensible thing? And that comes up again and again in my writing, but it's from lived experience. And yes, I think the humor hopefully makes it bearable. Hopefully makes it bearable. But I want to share a quote from Flaubert, which I love. He says, the art of writing is the art of discovering what you believe. And so I think as I wrote these stories, I was wrestling with what I believe. What do you do in these situations? And really just grappling with it down in the dirt. And I guess that's what I would hope the reader does as well. Not to come to my conclusion, but to come to their own. Because violence touches, people differently depending on your life circumstances. But I think as we go through life, we all experience some of it.
Indeed. Thank you. Again, there's so many ways we can go. I want to jump in with a slightly different tack for both of you as I'm looking at the time. Rachel, Maria, I'll start with Rachel and then we'll go to Maria. Let's talk about music for a minute but all three of us actually write opera librettos, and certainly Maria and Rachel do actively. And in fact, I wonder what the odds are that three of us would come together as poets and writers and writers of libretti. So Rachel, how does music inform your work as a writer? And then I will ask Maria that question as well. Rachel?
Well, I think my answer will be short and sweet. Poetry and music are so connected for me, and they help you choose the right word. They help you pay attention to rhythm and musicality, the sound of words, pay attention to the line. So in that way, I think they can make your language sing. They do not help with plot holes or problems. Even writing the libretto was such a challenge because I had to create this imaginary world, Fundamentalia, and I had to create a love story within it. So they help and they don't help, but I read and write in all genres, and I think they all overlap and they all add to one another in deep ways. Yeah.
Thank you. And certainly in the Octopus Has Three Hearts, this idea of lexicon or language, I felt you were doing some very interesting things, Rachel, for instance, in Porco Dio with the male voice and the words he uses and the way you juxtaposed his voice with his wife. I thought that was very interesting. Did you have any follow-up comments on that?
Thank you. I love to hear how people talk. It's one of my favorite things. And I think, growing up in rural places in rural Washington State and also rural British Columbia, you hear how people talk, how men talk to their animals, how people talk around you, different dialects, different ways of speaking about hunting, about animals, about marriage in ways that are quite foreign to where I live now in Kitsilano, and I'm deeply drawn to them.
I'm so glad you are. Maria, same question, because I read your stories in Good Citizens Need Not Fear in very similar ways, but this idea that you're actively writing opera libretti and you're writing these, as Shajibat said, these connected stories in novelistic form. How does music inform your work as a writer, Maria?
I think it bolsters my soul in a way. I find prose writing very isolating. I'm just, we're just alone in our rooms with people in our heads, but we're not talking to real people. And then once your book is out there, you have no, you don't know who's reading it, and you don't really have a direct way of communicating, nor do you want to. I mean, you don't want to be in the same room as your reader watching over their shoulder. That's very creepy. But so, yeah, I find fiction writing very isolating, but I do enjoy the control. But you are the stage manager, you're the choreographer. You get to decide everything, like the color of the curtains, right? But what I love about working on libretti is it's the opposite of that. So it's collaborative, right? So you're just a piece of this puzzle of this artwork, right? You write the script, and then the composer comes in with their own vision for how to infuse music into it, and then the stage director comes in, and then the singers they bring something magical into it too. So I love the collaborative aspect of it. I love that it gets me to talk to other people, and also, being in a room with your audience is terrifying, but thrilling. So you know right away when something is working on stage and when it's not working. Oh, you feel that too. So I love that, fiction writing and libretti writing, they're so different from one another. So they find that they complement each other that way. They fill in the gaps. Yeah.
Fill in the gaps, and that frisson when you're doing live, when I know Rachel has done it and her family does it live performance, and you nailed it. When it ain't working, it ain't there. Hey, I'm going to now dovetail again into a few more questions, because Rachel, I've been longing to ask you about that dedication in your book, which reads, "For anyone who has loved a beast." And I'm wondering if you could, you've touched on this, but could you go just a bit deeper on this animal-human connection that is so central to the Octopus Has Three Hearts?
Absolutely. I just wanted to say, before I jump into that, I so agree with and appreciate what you said, Maria, about the joys of collaborating when you write an opera and you write your thing and then you pass it on to the composer. You do back and forth, and then you get to see it come alive on stage, and you get to be around people who can sing, who can play music, who can do things that I never will ever be able to do, and who are just so inspiring. And to make something that's so much bigger than one person. Renée, I'm sure you resonate with this too. It's just such a gift, and to break that isolation. So I really could not agree more. In terms of for anyone who's ever loved a beast, that dedication, well, of course, it's a play on words, who are the real beasts in my stories, but also because we do sometimes find ourselves loving people who have done terrible things and don't know what to do with that. And love is, not a faucet that it's easy to turn off. And so I just invited the readers to go in open-heartedly and see what they think of these beasts that they discover in these pages, and just to be open to how it feels to read these stories and to meet with these people.
It's stunningly beautiful. And again, that sense of compassion for the unlovable, the unthinkable. And it forces us, as you say, I think if we think about that, and if we experience it as we do in both your books, it does force us to ask, as you were saying, what do we believe? Like, what are our beliefs? And Maria, I'm dying to put you on the spot about something that really came to me yesterday. Friday, pouring rainstorm, and I was going deep in these three Zaya stories. They're utterly they just destroy you in a way, her life, and then they don't. There's a love there in this very complex character in this brutalist regime. And what I wanted to ask you, Maria, my question that I'm going to ask you is, do you think, putting you on the spot a little, do you think there's a certain kind of psychosis in the totalitarian state? And will this be further worked out in perhaps a new novel you're working on?
Oh, interesting. What do you mean by psychosis?
Well, you tell me. I mean, okay, let's get into it a little. And I'd be delighted to hear from Rachel on this, as she has put us right in the now of the pandemic. Well, both of you have. We're in a pandemic, and I have never felt so grateful for the state on many levels. I've deep gratitude for a vaccination campaign that allows me to get double vaxxed, perhaps even a booster at some point. And it's coming through my taxpayer funded single payer healthcare system. That's the state in action. In your stories, pretty relentlessly, I believe, in Good Citizens Not Fear, we are faced with the psychosis of a totalitarian state. The baby house where Zaya is born is so frightening, and you have little diagrams in it about where the babies are, and this minister of health, oh my goodness, or the minister of the baby house, and how he decides who's suitable. So can you talk to me about this?
Right. Well, Yes, I think any state develops its own rules. And at some point, if you have too much power, you know, in a central, if the power is too centralized, those rules become more and more divorced from what people actually need. So you were talking about the baby house, right? So that's the institution where all these babies who are abandoned are put, right? And there's a cruelty in it, of course, but reading about these institutions, there was also this almost logic to it, and it's a screwed up logic, right? It's not about the human anymore, but there is a logic from the point of view of the state of why they are doing this. I remember in workshop, I wrote this story during my MFA, and some folks thought it was a dystopian story and that it wasn't in a real world, and they couldn't understand, well, why are these babies still being kept alive? Why doesn't the state just, why don't they just die? And like, people were actually shocked, why aren't they just killed if they're being kept alive this way? And but well, that's not the rule, that's not the system the state is operating on. Of course they're going to keep these babies alive because what they're telling the public is that everyone is being cared for in the state, right? They don't let anyone die outwardly. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
yeah, I think it absolutely does. It gives us insight into the world of these books. Rachel, my follow-up building on that is I've been looking again at the strange beasts. Were there any strange beasts that you just decided that you wrote about for this collection and decided I can't put this in here?
Well, maybe not for, I write a lot. So yes, there were stories that came that are not in the collection, but not because I was afraid of the reader's response to them, just because they weren't what I wanted them to be. They weren't good enough. They were, you know, the thousands of pages of failure that are somewhere else. But I had to write for my ideal reader and try to let the rest of it go and know that, you know, I had a lot of fear I'll be misread. And then I just had to tell myself, you will be misread. You will have readers who are not your ideal readers, who won't understand what you are trying to say, and that's okay. You're writing for your ideal reader, and your ideal reader is willing to hold complexity and willing to grapple with difficult subjects, and actually she enjoys doing that, and she's, you know, not easily offended, and she is willing to, you know, go into dark places and do that kind of deep thinking, and the rest you just write it and you let it go.
Oh, wow. That's so humbling and beautiful. Would you agree, Maria? And it was going to be my final question as we end this hour to both of you, the ideal reader. Do you have one, Maria?
Well, I think my first reader is my sister. She always looks at my early drafts because she's a big picture thinker. She's an ideas thinker. So even if my ideas aren't fully formed, they're not fully baked on the page, she'll be able to kind of see what the end goal is and give me the feedback. So really, I write for her in many ways. But apart from that, when I was writing this book, I really didn't think anyone was going to read it, and I think that's almost a gift of the debut writer. In some ways, you know, you want everyone to read your book, but in other ways, you really believe that no one will. So it gives you this freedom. Because you can't really imagine being, you know, critiqued, you know. You can't, so you can kind of do whatever you want. That's the thing you tell yourself. But then once your book is out and you actually do start to hear from readers, that veil you put over your eyes goes away. So I think that's what makes the second book a lot harder to work on, because, you know, some people are going to read it and they're going to have their own experiences they're going to put into the book. And this worry whether or not you captured, you know, that experience, that authenticity, it's definitely it's a bigger worry in the second book, at least for me. Yeah.
Mhm. Thank you, both of you. Have I missed anything that you're yearning to share? I love this idea of the ideal reader. And Rachel, anything that we're just about ending our time and we're going to turn over to Emily, but
I think it's such a fantastic conversation, and all of the subjects we've touched on, I could say so much more about. The next book after, and fears of being read, or the idea that you won't be read. Yes. I just wish that we were able to be in person and to talk with everybody here in the chat room, and to have those kind of conversations you have after reading, where you can come up and argue with people, or they can ask what was meant. But Renée, I so appreciate the questions that you asked, and your insight and your thoughtful response. And it's truly an honor to be reading with both of you. I think that my ideal reader would also truly appreciate Maria's book. And that's why I was so excited to meet you virtually today, Maria, because they understand how vulnerable the individual is against the forces of the state. And that's in any country. And we see now, even in Canada, where, as you say, I'm also so grateful for our functional state that's getting us vaccinated. We see that there is this narrative of fear and of deep distrust of the state that's growing. And I think that I want to write against that, but we need to be aware of it as well. And my ideal reader is. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Beautiful. Maria, anything that you want to close on before we turn it over to Emily?
Also, just to thank you. You asked such insightful questions. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you about it. And yeah, and Rachel as well, to hear your responses. Thank you.
Thank you both. I think Carolyn Smart, thank you so much for joining us, has said to both of you, you are both Bronwyn Wallace Award winners for fiction, and it is such a pleasure to see the two of you in conversation. I hope you'll get a chance to see the lovely comments in the chat. Thank you, dear readers and audience members. I'm now going to turn it over to Emily. It's been my pleasure to spend a Sunday morning with these talented, generous writers.
Thank you so much, Renée, Rachel, Maria. This was really such a beautiful way to sort of start or transition through the day. I'm sitting here watching my dog snooze in the corner and thinking about the complexities of species and empathy that you've brought up. And you've given us so much to think through and to further our thinking, both with generosity, but also with quite a number of challenges for us to think through. So thank you, everybody, for joining us as well, and for the audience's generosity and sharing their reflections, but also their questions for our authors. This was such a pleasure and an honor to be a small part of this event. And I'm so, again, grateful for everything that was shared and for coming together today. For those who are interested in attending more riveting discussions, I'll just put in our chat, we have plenty of events coming up through Massy Arts. It's really the busiest I think we've ever been in the year this fall, which is just great, because that just shows you that, authors are continuing to grace us with their brilliant work. So please do join us for more events. And of course, I'll remind you that all the books by all three of our guests are available for purchase through Massy Books. And yeah, we are an Indigenous-owned bookstore. We take our responsibilities to community pretty seriously. So you know that purchasing your books through an independent bookstore goes back to community, to authors, and to grassroots initiatives. So thank you. With much gratitude, we'll end the event there. And I wish everybody a beautiful rest of the day and hope to see you again at another event soon.